Of course, today's program was made possible. It was sponsored by Pikes Peak Heritage Series, which is a program of El Pomar Foundation. We are thrilled to partner with El Pomar and want them to thank them for making today's program possible. So thank you so much for that. I'd love to welcome Thayer Tutt Jr., who's representing El Pomar today and will be presenting both of our speakers. Just a quick little introduction for Mr. Tutt. Thayer Tutt Jr. is Vice Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of El Pomar Foundation. He is also the founder of Pikes Peak Heritage Series program at El Pomar, which is a program that focuses on celebrating and raising awareness of the natural assets of the Pikes Peak region. Outside of El Pomar, he serves on a variety of local, regional, and national boards and committees. So thank you so much for joining us today, Thayer. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you.
Meg, thank you very much. On behalf of the El Pomar Foundation and the Pikes Peak Heritage Series team, we're honored to partner with the Pikes Peak Pioneers Museum as we continue to celebrate the sesquicentennial anniversary, as well as the wonderful new Pioneer exhibit called Colorado Springs at 150. The Heritage Series program started 6 years ago. As Meg mentioned, its purpose is to celebrate and raise awareness of the natural assets of the Pikes Peak region. We do that through meetings of different types and different locations that the community is interested in participating in. We've had a variety of topics over the last couple of years, most recently talking about forest health, the Pikes Peak multi-use plan, and most recently, a panel of diverse leaders talked about equity and inclusion in the outdoors. Today's topic is an exciting one for me. With my geology background, I'm fascinated with the interrelationship between population growth and the use and availability of water resources. So this topic is very relevant as we move forward. I would like to now introduce our first speaker, Eric Perramond. He is an environmental geographer, a political ecologist, and a professor of environmental science and Southwest Studies at Colorado College. He has quite a pedigree academically with an undergraduate degree from Murray, Washington, and Virginia, a master's from Louisiana State University, and a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. He's with us today because of his latest book entitled Unsettled Waters, Rights, Law, and Identity in the American West, which analyzes the challenges of water rights adjudications and how infrastructure, prior appropriations, and redefining water as a private use right has disrupted past notions of communal and indigenous waters. Eric, welcome today, and I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Thayer. I appreciate it. And I want to thank the museum for also inviting me to provide some context for today's presentation. And I'm really not the star. This is really going to be about the documents and the archives themselves that Casey Pearce will present. But I think I was asked because I have at least some background on this. And one of the aspects that really fascinated me when I first got to CC back in 2005 was trying to relocate some of my research that had been prior in northern Mexico. And I thought, well, what better project than water in the West? And I chose New Mexico for a variety of reasons. And you'll forgive my kind of modification of the program title here to almost sound like a 19th century book title. It gets longer and longer. But I wanted to give a little bit of context to really think through how similar, even if Casey Pearce is going to talk about the details of what makes Colorado Springs different, how similar Colorado Springs' urban experience and the urbanization of water, especially in the 20th century, we share a lot in common with LA, with Las Vegas, with Phoenix. And so without further ado, I'll talk a little bit about that. The cover here on the left, I want to acknowledge, comes from the Colorado Springs and now Colorado College Fine Arts Center. And it's a painting by Chuck Forsman, who was a CU Boulder art professor a long time. And he allowed me to use this as the book cover for Unsettled Waters, which came out a couple of years ago now. Time flies when you're in a pandemic, at the University of California Press. And so I want to acknowledge that, because to me, when I saw this painting, I thought, there's the book cover. It was in one painting, the whole critique of what I wanted to get at in terms of what we've done to water and not just with water. That is indeed a painting of the Cochiti Dam in northern New Mexico. If you've been there, there's an overlook that looks almost exactly like that. So without further ado, I wanted to give a little context here before Casey Pearce talks about the local dynamics and specifics of archives and documents that can be found at the Colorado Springs Pioneer Museum collection. And part of this is giving some emphasis to thinking about law and how much it is part of our technology, part of our infrastructure. So just as much as dams, just as much as canals and diversion points and transfer canals and transfer tunnels, really, here in Colorado that we've bored through the Front Range to try to get western slope water to the Front Range. And some of this is really prevalent across the West. So anything here in white across all of these states, from Washington, Oregon, Nevada, all the way to Texas, including Colorado, obviously, and New Mexico, really are based on prior appropriation water law. So not riparian water law, it's a little bit distinct, but the first in time, first in right basis that I think most folks should be familiar with, but so associated with Colorado that in New Mexico, it was called the Colorado Doctrine. And it emerged in the 1880s as water, interestingly, became, at least water use, a kind of private property right, and not just part of a river, part of a stream. And prior appropriation has sort of its initial roots in both California and Colorado mining camps as a way to stop people from shooting each other over mining claims and the use of water at the time. So it's sort of a easy dispute resolution that used raw dates as a way to organize and sort out who was a senior and junior water rights user. And as part of this, the left-hand side here gives you some notion of what I mean by prior appropriation if you're not familiar with this. But senior water rights get sorted out as a higher right to all of the water they have rights to if they've been using them for beneficial use. Junior user rights come after. And so it's all relative. So there would be users between 1910 and 1970, obviously, but it becomes a pecking order. The map on the right is straight from the book, and it really was to convey to audiences, elsewhere in the West, how difficult, how long it has taken for a single state, New Mexico, to try to adjudicate, in other words, count, map, allocate, and certify who has water rights in every basin of the state, which is no small task the way they've done it. So unlike Colorado, where you take your individual claims to a water court, state court, to certify your water claims, the state of New Mexico actually sues people in a sub-basin and sends paperwork, letter after letter of offer once the research has been done. So it's very much an archival and historical hunting expedition for good records, good dates, to try to certify who has water rights. And the hope was, when this process was created, rather optimistically, in 1907, and they're only halfway done, maybe halfway after a century, that some water might be left in the system to allocate for further development. I think that's wishful thinking. I'm happy to comment on that further. But adjudication, as a process, is really fundamental to understanding how each individual Western state counts and tries to account for what water is available or not available anymore. So this notion of water as a property right, we don't own the water. We actually own the use right to access water in particular places. That's typically the arrangement in Western states. And there's a fundamental disconnect. Some people think they actually own the water. They don't. That's usually a state-owned public trust resource that is then held and then certified as a use right. Now, this is going to get a little more local, but I've scaled this out a little bit to provide some context. These are sort of the main diversions that everyone, I hope, in K through 12 is seeing at some point in their education, if not in college. We have divisions in Colorado, 6 main divisions here that allocate, 7 main divisions that allocate the distribution of these water resources and manage water rights through the water courts. So each one of these divisions has a water court, and you see the sort of the major tunnels and arrows there. Sorry if it's a fine detail. It's kind of hard to crank up the level of resolution here at this scale. But those are the main tunnels and main ditches that have largely transferred over the 20th century and in some ways late 1800s but mostly 20th century. The main diversions that move water from Western Slope to the Front Range, including Colorado Springs. So we're right in here. You are here, as most maps like to joke. And we depend on a variety of tunnels, including Hoosier Pass, but we take water from Breckenridge and other parts from the Arkansas River as well. In fact, the Southern Delivery System now taps into the dam right above Pueblo to move water uphill 1,500 feet to us in Colorado Springs, and that's nearly a doubling of the city's water portfolio. So this is both a deep archival, historical, and geographic kind of process that's really fundamental, I think, for people to understand where most of these water resources are coming from, mostly from the West. 80% of the water, west side of the state, 80% of the population on the Front Range. Oops. We're not great at sorting ourselves out historically in places that actually had the water. And I think part of the story too, was I was just fascinated in the book, is tracking how our relationship to water has changed from sort of a rural context where we could allocate, in a small ditch kind of setting or community ditch. In New Mexico, a lot of these are called acequias, if they've been there for hundreds of years, to one that redefines water as a state kind of concern. And this is, part of the map here of New Mexico that I was centered on for the book project. And then if we scale even further out, it's not just a matter of what water is in each state, because we know we're a headwater state and all the water in Colorado is going somewhere else. And even more broadly, that there's the hydrological cycle. So we can't stop water from moving out of state or from evaporating or from transpiring. And if you look at this larger map, especially the Colorado River Basin, I think one of the telling stories that I think students are, in my classes are always struck by is how much water from the upper and lower basins, the Colorado River here, actually finds its way outside of the basin. So these diversions have completely changed the hydrology of the region. They've completely changed the water dependency we have in the West. And it's a pretty striking story. So everywhere along the Front Range, if you go down to New Mexico, this allocation here is really coming out of Navajo Dam, but from the San Juan River allocation that gave New Mexico some of the Colorado River tributary water. So they decided to pipe that across through the San Juan Chama project down through the Chama River into the Rio Grande. So that explains this. And then, as I hope everyone knows, the sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room for Western water law is early California use, transferring water out of the Colorado River and basically moving it across the Mojave Desert, across vast stretches, creating the Salton Sea, and then over to San Diego and especially Los Angeles, the larger metropolitan river there. So we have a lot of straws in the major rivers, mainly the Colorado River and the Rio Grande, and everybody is hedging their bets on putting in a new straw on these main rivers, even as the flow declines, And I'm happy to talk about this later in context too, and maybe Casey Pearce has documents on this, but this notion of how we're going to allocate and reallocate in a just way, our constant historical obligations to Native American sovereign tribes, most of which are unmet at this date across the West. We have unmet rural water needs. And then this is an old Bureau of Reclamation map from 2003. And all I'm going to exit with as a context here is to say, anything that says conflict potential and the darker it gets on the gray shading here, you'll notice that we're right in one of the bullseye areas, right? Like right here on the Front Range, conflict likely. That should surprise no one. Albuquerque as well. The strip out in eastern Arizona is subject to problems because of the allocation of rivers out there. Tucson and Phoenix, you have strips, right, of kind of urban areas that are going to have problems. This map, I will say bluntly, does not account for climate change. It does not account for climate change. So take this map, minus 20% water, 15% water in some cases. And that's a pretty realistic picture of what we're facing. So I wanted to tinker a little bit with the Quenching Our Thirst title in that first title slide, only because I don't think our thirst is unquenchable right now. I think we just keep asking for more water as development has occurred. And I think we're going to learn more about sort of the archival footprint here in the Springs that residents of Colorado Springs and the Front Range can come and see and learn from. And I value them as well. Like, this book would not have been written without archival documents from New Mexico. And these are rich inventories to tell stories today about things that happened in the past, but they still matter because we have not resolved these issues. So that's going to be the end of my comments right now. I just want to lay out some general context. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Tutt here to then gracefully exit myself and hand it over to Casey at some point. Thanks.
Eric, thank you very much for providing not only context of water resources in the Rocky Mountain West, but also down here on the Front Range. You sort of whetted our appetites, and now we turn it over to Casey Pearce. Let me give you a little bit about her background. She's a Colorado native and local historian who grew up just west of here in Teller County. Her academic background is in history, anthropology, and archives and record management. She received both her undergraduate and master's degree from the University of Colorado Springs, and he continues to this day as an adjunct professor at UCCS. Her job title in the city of Colorado Springs right now is Record Systems Administrator for the city of Colorado Springs. And one of the most interesting things for me is she is the person who's bringing our historical records to life, not only organizing them, but making them available both to city employees and to the public. Casey, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Thayer, for that introduction, and thank you, Eric, for your contribution. It definitely provides context for what we're going to be talking about today, what we've gone through in the past, and then issues we're facing in the future. I'm primarily going to be talking about past records, though. So let's go ahead, and a few things before I get started. The city clerk's office has many thousands of records relating to water development, and obviously I cannot share all those with you today. What you're going to see today is a small fraction of the records that I have inventoried and preserved. I have a long way to go with that, but to date, this is what I've come across, and so I've compiled this for you guys to take a look. Again, they're just a small fraction of the collection that we have over at the city clerk's office. In selecting these for this presentation today, I tried to choose records that have place names that you'll recognize or that were vital to the development of our water supply in this city today. Some of these documents have been cropped in the interest of space. Most of them are just only one page of many. Many of these files are, 50 or 100 pages long, especially the court decrees and things like that that we'll be looking at today. So moving along, let me see if I can get my screen share to work here. Come on, there we go. Okay. A little bit more information there about the city clerk's office. We're the official repository for many of the records produced throughout the course of business for the city. All kinds of records that we produce there. Most of these are available to the public. With forewarning, I can pull them for you if you want to look at things like that. Again, I'll be using a variety of records for my presentation today that includes land deeds, water records, court decrees, legal opinions, agreements, ordinances, contracts, federal records, letters from citizens, and a lot more. So I hope that you enjoy what you're about to see. I divided the presentation today into 3 segments, essentially, based on time. And the first one we're going to talk about is 1871 to 1930. This period of time, city land and water records reveal that early water sources in the city came primarily from streams, ditches, and shallow wells that were dug around the city, what is basically now the larger downtown area that we're talking about. Most of our local streams at the time were targeted for water resources, and water rights in local streams and ditches are the first rights that are secured by the city. And we know from Eric now they're actually water use rights. On the right here of the screen, you can see some of the types of records that we'll be looking at today in this process. Okay, let's talk a little bit about streams and ditches. Early streams targeted for water rights around the city include Catamount Creek, Beaver Creek, Bear Creek, Monument Creek, and Fountain Creek. Again, all the names that you're hearing today, these have been pulled directly from the records that we have at the city clerk's office. Ditches mentioned in the city records, there's a whole list of them there, quite a few. That's just a fraction of really how many ditches are mentioned in city records, water records. Around this time, we are also getting into building our first reservoir and tunnel systems, and this is going to be on Pikes Peak. Natural lakes and reservoirs that were added to Pikes Peak's southern slope between 1871 and 1930 are listed there. They include Lake Moraine, which was a natural lake that they added a dam to, a number of other reservoirs, Pike View, Bomer, Bighorn, Wilson, Mason. Many of these are in the Seven Lakes region, that is on the southern slope of Pikes Peak. You can see a picture there on the bottom right of some tourists at Seven Lakes in 1876. Once the city acquired this property and actually began constructing our reservoirs, we did close it off to the public, and I don't believe it's been reopened, but it has been closed to the public since about 1900 or so. Along with these reservoirs, we created tunnels. We had to get the water down to Colorado Springs. Two of the main tunnels we did are St. John's Tunnel, which is built in 1904 and brought water from Mason Reservoir to Lake Moraine. So we're moving water on the slope of Pikes Peak with this one. It was named for Council President and Water Commission Chairman, J.C. St. John. Another tunnel, which actually is pretty important to the history of water development in the state as well, is Strickler Tunnel. It was completed in 1900 and it conveys water from West Beaver Creek drainage to the South Slope area. And it was named for William A. Strickler, who was the mayor at the time. All right, let's take a look at some of the records, the fun stuff we're going to get to now. All right, so our earliest ditch decrees and water rights. This is some of what you're looking at here. Ditches, including the El Paso Canal, brought water from natural stream sources to the city of Colorado Springs. Right on the left here of your screen, you're going to see some records relating to the El Paso Canal. It was constructed by Palmer and it brought water from Fountain Creek to the city. It was about 6 miles long. On the left there, you can see we have the El Paso Canal indenture, 1882. I pulled out a section of that there and superimposed it on top so that you can see Palmer's signature on the document. It's a certified copy of decree in the matter of priority water rights for the El Paso County Canal. So as Eric said, water rights are basically all litigation, and primarily what we have in the city collection is litigation records. That's definitely the predominant stuff that we have there. The next record you can see is a deed for El Paso Canal, and that was done in August of 1877. Oops, we went too fast. Don't get excited. All right. Early city records show the acquisition of hundreds of ditches and general land purchases for associated water rights, including El Paso Canal. City records like court decrees show that by far the most contentious water source in the city were ditches and the water rights that we achieved in those ditches. Most cases we won. Like the Tooth Ditch and Fremont Ditch cases, which you'll see next. Some we lost, and others we fought more than once. Bear Creek and Beaver Creek show up over and over and over again for a series of about 30 years where we have continuing court cases going on with those two streams and ditch supplies. Other documents in this screen is a petition to the mayor and city clerk against the city taking water rights from the Cheyenne Creek. And this is from the owners of the Cheyenne Ditch in 1895. So essentially we were put on notice that we didn't have access to the water from that ditch. It appears from looking at the document that we were actually taking water at the time without rights. The other document you see is a provisional decree regarding water district number 12 in Beaver Creek. So there apparently are two different water districts, 10 and 12. I am by no means an expert on the water development system. This is what I'm taking from the documents. And number 12 includes Beaver Creek. So we have a decree there. And we also have a quitclaim deed for the Bott Ditch. Anybody who's been around a little bit maybe have heard of Anthony Bott and the Bott addition on the west side of town, what we call Old Colorado City now. Okay. Next slide, we have some more records for you guys to look at. Again, these are all relating to ditch decrees and water rights in the city prior to about 1900. On the right, we can see records related to the Tooth Ditch, including a decree, a water rights deed, and testimony from a court case. We have the Fremont County Ditch Decree as well. Fremont County at this time was probably part of Teller County. Teller County wasn't created until 1891. We have the Bear Creek Ditch Decree. So again, Bear Creek is one that comes up all the time that we have a lot of stuff going on with. And then some more adjudication records relating to Water District 12. So again, as you can see, a lot of what we have relates to court records, right? For trying to acquire ditches and competing with other people in the region who also, needed water. All right. Next slide, we have additional decrees and cases showing the contentiousness of relationships with other communities and companies in our pursuit. So again, Colorado Springs is not the only city here. Colorado City was here. There are other communities along the Front Range who need water as well, including indigenous communities, which Eric touched on just a little bit. In this screen, you can see that we obviously had some ongoing issues with Victor. We have a decree in the matter of Victor, Colorado versus the city of Colorado Springs. We have court proceedings in regards to that case between Victor and Colorado Springs. We have another decree for Beaver Creek water rights. We have legal opinions in regards to Colorado Springs Waterworks. And a lot of those legal opinions are coming from our city attorney's office. And they relate to basically how should we go about pursuing these rights? How should we defend ourselves in court against people who are also after the same rights? And then we have water line rights in Colorado City. And so what that is us having right of way to lay water mains through Colorado City to supply water. That kind of becomes important with the next slide, and we'll talk about that. These acquisition records are accompanied by various legal opinions and records reflecting the city's forward-thinking approach to water resources and how we could pursue them. So that's the legal opinions. Legal opinions on the sinking of wells. That one relates to the city looking at sinking wells east of here, around the area of what is now Circle Drive, to see if there's water supply out there, or to basically show that there is water supply to encourage expansion for the city and to get people to come here. We have a legal opinion on Cheyenne Canyon water rights. That relates to the acquisition of Cheyenne Canyon for a park, which happened shortly after this. Part of what we were looking at when we acquired Cheyenne Canyon for a park was, could we have the water rights as well? And so that legal opinion talks about that. We'll move along to the next slide. All right, let's see. I talked about how we were expanding our water mains into Old Colorado City, places like Old Colorado City. Part of the reason is because we were getting requests for service. Not only are we thinking forward about in terms of growth and future population coming in, we're also facing pressures from existing populations for water service. People want to start tapping into our water supply, which is something that, you know, hasn't really changed too much in the past. Most of these requests, as you can see here, came from individuals or local neighborhoods. We have petition for water service in Harrison's edition, in the North End edition, Owens, Love, and Quinby edition, and the Grandview edition in Colorado City. Keep some of these names in mind because a little bit further on, we will see the plat maps where we actually annex these neighborhoods. So these people aren't part of the city yet, but they're asking for water service. If you do genealogy or anything like that, you can, you know, it's interesting to see the addresses and names of the people who were living there at the time. And they're requesting water service. We also got requests for water service from local businesses. Here we have a request for water service at the new Antlers Hotel. And this request comes from the Colorado Springs Hotel Company. You can see on the upper left there that William J. Palmer is the president. So in September of 1899, they asked to have a new water meter installed for water service at the new hotel. We also have a request from the Union Printers Home on the right side of your screen for water after they were newly constructed. So people are moving to the city at the time. We're expanding, we're putting in businesses, we're putting in residences and that sort of thing. And so we're starting to get more and more demand for water. With that process, we also start to expand our infrastructure. These city records, which include ordinances, contracts, agreements, they show the request for service combined with the recognition of the need for future residents led to the expansion of our system. An expansion, this is a physical expansion. So we see a lot of right-of-way deeds here, particularly again through Colorado City. Colorado City was one of the larger areas that was already established that we ended up annexing. So there were a lot of people there who needed water supply. And so while it was being litigated, interestingly, we were also getting demand for water mains, and we were putting in water mains and getting right-of-way deeds to put water mains into Colorado City. We also have contracts here between the city and the Suburban Land and Water Company. What that's about is we were going to allow them to have their water come through our pipes so we could increase our flow and better service our citizens. Suburban Land and Water Company is one of many other water supply companies that existed at the time, and I'll talk about that momentarily. We were not the only people looking for water rights in this region, and Eric touched on that, right? It's a very contentious issue and has been for a long time. Another document that you'll see on here is a decree granting the right-of-way to the city of Colorado Springs for laying pipe and water mains on Pikes Peak Land and Mining Company's property. Okay, so we're expanding further. We also, in addition to water right deeds and agreements and that sort of thing, we have records that show the work was actually done. We have agreements on here. You can see there's an agreement for a wooden water pipe, bringing water from Prospect Lake to Evergreen Cemetery. We have other records that include, for example, bills like the one you see in the bottom right-hand corner, which is a bill for pipeline work from the Highline Reservoir. So in addition to having the right-of-way deeds for these things and the legal opinions on what's going on, we have the bills that have been submitted, the contractors who built this stuff for us as we're moving and expanding our system out. And again, you guys are seeing a tiny fraction of what we have. We have thousands and thousands of records. All right, as our infrastructure is expanding, we're also trying to continue to expand our assets, right? Water rights and land that the city owns in order to secure our future here. Records like deeds and stock certificates show that along with new infrastructure, we acquired our competitors, we acquired mining claims and stock rights. They also show city leaders making an ambitious plan for a series of reservoirs around the city and on the slopes of Pikes Peak. These reservoirs included tunnel systems for delivering water from the peak to the city's ditches. I talked a little bit, I was going to mention the other regional water suppliers that existed at the time. These are the people, again, that we're competing with for water rights in the city. And I know of their names because they're all over the city records. They include the Beaver Creek Water Supply Company, Suburban Land and Water Company, Empire Water and Power, Colorado Springs Heat Power and Water Company, Northfield Land and Water, Broadmoor Hotel Water and Power Company, Brookside Water Company, Ute Park Land and Water Company, Cherokee Water District, Colorado City Water Company, and on and on and on. There were a lot of other companies here providing water for the city. This obviously is prior to the city itself taking over and privatizing our water, or not privatizing, but making our water supply public. All right, as we move on, you'll see that most of these private companies were actually bought out by the city as we expanded our systems and our rights and engulfed their territories. What you guys are looking at here is for one, the deed to the Colorado Springs Light and Power land and rights for Manitou Springs. So in 1923, we bought Colorado Springs Land and Power, Light and Power, their land, their system, and their water rights. Northfield Land and Water deed, we purchased their system. Colorado City Water Company stock. So if we weren't purchasing their system, we were often buying stock in their companies to gain control of water rights. We have a warranty deed for water rights for El Paso County that we bought from El Paso County. We have a mining deed for claims in Teller County. This is, again, one of many. We have hundreds and hundreds of mine claim deeds in our collection. I don't know if many of you know about mining, but when you're underground mining, water is often coming out of the mine. And so that's why there's water rights associated with many of these and why the city has so many mine claims on the peak. And then I also included here a homestead certificate, original homestead certificate from 1891 for William P. Height. It's in our records, but it doesn't say why we have it. I'm assuming we have it because we purchased the property that he had settled for the water rights at some point. So you can see down there, it was issued by Benjamin Harrison. Give you a second to look at those. All right. On the next screen, we're going to talk about some more asset documents that I found for you guys to look at. These primarily relate to reservoirs that the city purchased. We have a quitclaim deed for Crater Reservoir. We have deeds for Prospect Lake. You can see there we have a deed for Ute Reservoir. Some of these reservoirs are in Teller County. Some are on the slope of Pikes Peak and some are closer to the city. I'm not definitely, again, an expert on where they're all located at, unfortunately. We have quitclaim deed for water on Glendale and Palmer ranches. So we're also buying ranches and other land for their water rights. We have an abstract of title to the Seven Lakes Storage Reservoir region in Teller County. And so we touched on Seven Lakes just a little bit earlier. That's the beginning of the reservoir system on Pikes Peak. It starts with Seven Lakes reservoirs. The city bought that piece of property for $70,000 in 1891. So that was a huge expenditure that we put out at the time to secure that property for our water supply system. And you can also see we have a warranty deed for the 33rd Street pump house site. So the El Paso Canal left Fountain Creek at that location originally. And so that's why we have a pump house site there. Okay, some more records for you guys to look at. These relate to projects going on the peak at the time, a little bit later, turn of the century. Records like engineering proposals, bid tallies, and litigation records show further expansion onto Pikes Peak and our continuing legal troubles. Again, that's pretty much the underpinning of all water records is legal litigation. Strickler Tunnel, we talked a little bit earlier about St. John's and Strickler Tunnel. It replaced the Timberline Flume, which was a 7-mile long wooden flume that brought water from West Beaver Creek to the city. It would freeze over in the winter and obviously had other issues. Parts of it are still visible today, but it wasn't reliable. And so the city starts a process to build the Strickler Tunnel to bring water down from the reservoirs. What documents you're looking at here include the Clough and Anderson proposal, specifications and contract for constructing the St. John Tunnel, and that's from 1904. We have a tally of bids for the Strickler Tunnel. So again, in addition to just legal records and water right decrees, we have the records related to construction of these early resources as well. What people paid for pipes, what people paid to have a dam built, or people, the city of Colorado Springs. We have legal opinions, again, on the rights, duties, et cetera, of Colorado Springs in regard to Strickler Tunnel. We have a case, Simmons versus Strickler, and then we have a resolution down at the bottom to mark that the tunnel was completed. Again, I'm not an expert, but I did come across some information that Strickler Tunnel apparently set precedents. The lawsuits around it set some precedents for water rights in the state of Colorado going forward. So it was a big deal for the city. We invested a lot of money in doing this, and we have a lot of records that relate to that Strickler Tunnel, which is bringing us water again from the peak. Okay, some more records. What we have here basically is you can see from petition records, legal opinions, and resolutions that we paid for our expansion in part via water bonds and government grants. Like, you're also paying via water rents, which is what your water bill was called at the time. But we held elections to issue water bonds to pay for our expansion. And that's something that we continue to do to this day, is to use bonds. Most municipalities do, to advance infrastructure projects. And so we started using bonds to advance our infrastructure project pretty quickly by 1903. You can see there on that. We did get grants from the US government, particularly in the 1930s, which helped cover the cost of some of our expansions as well. They related to the Depression and Depression era funds that were coming out of Washington, DC to help development in the West. And we obviously were part of the Dust Bowl, for anybody who knows their history about that. And then over here on the right, I have a little Ramona versus the city of Colorado Springs water case. Ramona, basically, it appears from what it says in the newspaper article there from the Gazette, was demanding that we provide water for their saloon owners. And at the time, we had not annexed them. It ended up going to court, and the city won. We did not have to provide them water supply if we didn't want to, because they weren't annexed into our city. Eventually, we do annex them. Ramona, from what I can tell from the maps, looks like it was part of eastern Colorado City at the time. So again, we still have people asking for service, right? And sometimes suing for that service. Next slide, we're going to look at some federal government records that we have in our collection. These records show how closely involved the federal government was in the expansion of our system on Pikes Peak, and that is due to the fact that the federal government technically owned Pikes Peak at the time. They issued us a series of land grants so that we could build our reservoir system on there and protect that watershed. And so these are what you're looking at here. There's an original act of Congress granting land and water rights on the south slope of Pikes Peak to the city, and that's in 1896. It grants us about 3,100 acres. And south slope is where our Seven Lakes Reservoir system is, and St. John and Strickler tunnels. We also have a original patent certificate for a parcel of land and water rights on the south slope of Pikes Peak. And so that was an additional grant that we got in 1903 as we're expanding that region up there. And then you can see in 1913, we get a congressional grant for watershed development on the north slope of Pikes Peak. So even by early turn of the century, we are expanding into the north slope to start building reservoirs and storing water there as well. Because what we have is it is meeting the demand. As far as I could tell, the population numbers weren't too large at the time, but obviously they were very forward thinking in what they were doing. The city was aggressively pursuing water rights across the region, buying up as many ditches as they can and that sort of thing. Other water supply companies, as we've seen. And so they were definitely forward thinking in what they were doing for us at the time. Some additional records I just wanted to stick in here before we move on to post-1930 numbers. We have reports from engineers, we have reports from water commissioners, we have reports from attorneys in regards to the water system. We have reports about the number of pipelines and how much water is coming through them. We have reports about the system in general and what we need to build it into the future. We have reports from lawyers about legal rights and legal issues they saw coming up and different things like that. And so here you can see just a small example of the different kind of things we have that relate to that, right? What city records that were going on at the time related to our water supply. All right, let's talk a little bit about annexations because we want to talk about population growth, right? You can see here a list of the first 21 annexations that happened in the city. And these take us up to about 1917. In 1880, our population was about 4,200. By 1900, that reaches about 2,100. By 1920, we're up to about 30,000. Or I'm sorry, by 1900, it's 21,000. By 1920, it's about 30,000. And then 1930, there's only about 33,000. And so we have pretty steady population growth in the early 1900s. That does tend to taper off a little bit in the 1930s, but our annexations of areas correlate to that growth. Between 1871 and 1917, we added about 5,200 acres to the city. Patterns of growth at the time, we were growing east and north primarily. Between 1917 and 1946, there's again kind of a pause. We're not annexing anything in that period of time, and there isn't a huge population growth. So what we're looking at here are some of the annexation maps that we have. These are from a compiled book of plat maps that the city clerk's office has, many hundreds of pages. And so again, I'm just taking a sampling for you, but you can start to see some of these areas that we talked about. These are really interesting to look at and try to find your street or your neighborhood, depending on where you guys live. But what you're looking at here is Roswell City Edition 1 and 2, and then City City Edition number 1 and City Edition number 2, and the regions that came in at the time. So Roswell is kind of, I'm trying to think, it's north of, it's just south of Fillmore in Nevada. There's a little area over there. It used to be Roswell City. And you can kind of tell from the map that we're starting to annex that area. They have the annexation names on them very faintly. So you can kind of tell if you can look close enough at what you're looking at here. Okay, we're going to move on to the next plat map really quickly. And these include the North End Edition. So that's what we consider the old North End now, right? The Corona Edition, Woods Edition, and more. So some of these maps show numerous additions. Additions could be as much as a couple blocks or, you know, hundreds of acres. It just kind of depended on who was petitioning to get annexed at the time. And so you can see there with the hollow letters on there, some of the names for the different additions coming in. Woods Edition, which is along Wood Avenue, that sort of thing. On the upper right, there is the Owen, Love, and Quimby's Edition. So that is where, remember from earlier, we had citizens petitioning for water supply, and that is in Old Colorado City now. They wanted water supply, and so eventually we annexed them as we provided them water supply. Next plat map we've got to look at here includes the East End Edition and Prospect Lake Edition. So again, we're moving east and north from the city. And you can see the areas that were annexed at this time. So just south of Prospect Lake, if you remember from a previous screen, we just bought the site to Prospect Lake and we're filling it with water. We're putting in houses down there below it. And on the left side, you can see the East End Edition and the addition and the blocks that were brought in from that area. You can see Memorial Hospital down there in the bottom left corner. Okay, so that's the area we're talking about. It stretches eastward into the Nob Hill area as well. And the next plat map we're going to look at for this time frame shows the East Colorado City Edition, the Ramona Edition, and Botts Edition. So these again are Old Colorado City areas. You can see here on this document, there's the Ramona Edition. Okay, so those are the people who wanted water service for their saloons initially. And then the Bott Edition is in Western Old Colorado City at this time, where Anthony Bott had property. All right. Moving along, 1930 to 1980 is what we're going to look at next. And I will try to speed it up a little bit because we're running out of time. We're seeing a lot of the same water records being produced at this time, right? That we were before, although the record storage system in the city is becoming decentralized. And so a lot of records aren't coming into the city at the time. So we're more limited a little bit in what we have to look at. Though that's slowing, we still have requests for service, acquisition of land and water rights, agreements, contracts, that sort of thing that we're going to be looking at. Really briefly, I'll look at the Trans Mountain Diversion System. This is what's built during this time between 1930 and 1980. After a pause in annexations up till 1946, the mid to late 20th century is essentially marked by an explosion of population and annexations and communities needing water service. And that correlates to the city reaching further west for our water supply and going into Trans Mountain Diversion Systems, which Eric touched on just a little bit. These diversions are designed to bring water from the western slope to the city. You can see this map here that's provided by CSU, where those are at this time and where they're coming to. Today, Colorado has over 24 major tunnels that bring water to the western slope. Trans Mountain diversions provide 60 to 70% of the water being used by Colorado Springs. And they include the Blue River Project, which was started in 1947. It includes it's the Blue River Hoosier Tunnel project. The tunnel was finished in 1949. The whole project was finished in 1952, and it brings water into the Montgomery Reservoir for storage and use by citizens in Colorado Springs. From Montgomery Reservoir, which is located in Alma, the water then flows down the Blue River pipeline for storage on the north slope of Pikes Peak and our reservoirs that are up there. The Blue River Hoosier Project provides about 13% of our drinking water. You can see on this map, there's also the Homestead Project. It was a partnership with Aurora that started in the 1950s, completed by the 1960s, includes a tunnel, the Little Annie and Goddard Tunnel, that's about 5,900 feet long and brings water down through the Arkansas River Valley via the Otero Pump Station to reservoirs on Pikes Peak. And then there's the Frying Pan Arkansas Project, which is started in the 70s, increased our water supply by 50% and brings, again, water through a system of diversions and tunnels down to storage for Colorado Springs in our reservoirs down here. Obviously, if we're expanding outward, we have to expand our water rights. And so you can see here, again, we're making purchases all over the place to expand water rights. These are primarily located west of El Paso County, or it's some east, right? There's an agreement with the Banning Lewis family for the purchase of water in 1955. Some of you guys might be familiar with that name. There are contracts for purchases of water rights on the Blue River. There are Park County water right agreements, lots of deeds related to the Blue River. And then you can see here, there is a deed from Venatucci, the Venatucci brothers, for water rights at their farm. And so Venatucci Farm, again, is south of Colorado Springs, and the city owns the water rights from that farm. Next, we have some new assets that we're bringing in. Again, as we're expanding, we're still bringing in other businesses, right? Companies that we're providing, primarily companies that were providing water around the city that as we're expanding into their territory. You can see a warranty deed for Ute Pass Land and Water Company. We talked about them earlier, right? We bought them, their entire system and all their water rights at that time. We have an agreement for purchase and sale of property of the Northfield Land and Water Company. So in the 50s, again, 40s and 50s, we're starting to acquire or continuing to acquire these other water supply companies and centralize our system. There is a certificate there for the completion of the Hoosier Tunnel, sorry, I can't talk. And there's another grant from the US government for water development. This is just an idea of the number of records we have. Unfortunately, I don't have time again to show you all of them. We're very limited. And so I just wanted to give you just a quick list. Again, we have hundreds, if not thousands of records that relate to the water system development from the beginning through about the 1980s or so. After the 1980s, again, the system is decentralizing, records are staying with their issuing departments, and the city splits from Colorado Springs Utilities, and so now they keep their own records related to that. But these are just some of the records that we have on file that relate to the development of Blue River, Homestake, and Frying Pan systems that we're bringing water into us for our population. Let's look at annexations. So these are some of the neighborhoods that were annexed between 1930 and 1980. Again, there's a pause until about 1946, the end of the war, and then it just really blows up. Between 1946 and 1980, we annexed almost 55,000 acres of land via 425 separate annexation agreements. So if that gives you just an idea of how many annexation agreements we enacted at the time. And so this is just a few of the names that I figured you guys might recognize if you see your neighborhood or something on there like that. In 1940, the population had increased to about 36,000 people. By 1960, we're at 70,000. By 1980, we're at 215,000 people in the city, right? So that reflects all these huge annexations, and that's being supplied by this system of diversion that we're building on the western slope of the state. Annexation maps for this period of time. We have here on this screen the Haynes, Boulder Heights, and Highland additions. Again, there's multiple additions shown in each one of these. So this is essentially, you can see the area around the Colorado School of Deaf and Blind. Down there on the bottom, we have the area that is just southeast of Memorial Park and Prospect Lake, the Hillside, Pikes Peak, Ord, and Swoop annexations. On the right, we have Palmer Park addition. And then on the upper right, we have a section of, I can't see my screens on top of it. I can move it. There we go. All right, I can see a little better, sorry. A section on the upper right is Constitution and Union area. So I will say this, that looking at these maps, it seems like a lot of the names of streets in the city have been changed at some point in time, because a lot of them I don't recognize at all. Some of the main ones, of course, Constitution, Union, Platte, those sort of things you still see there. But a lot of these names have been changed. All right, next screen, we are looking at some more additions. Pleasant Valley is one that we took in at this time. That is on the west side of town, 31st Street area you can see there. The Kitty Hawk addition, that is the Templeton Gap Road area. We brought them in at the time as well. And then on the bottom there, the Paseo addition, which again looks like it's around Union and North Circle area. And then one more plat map screen for you guys, Highland Village, Palmer Heights additions, and others. And you can kind of look at this for a second. You can see on the upper right, there's Maysland Road. That's pushing out around the base of Palmer Park. On the bottom right there, you can see Uinta Street. Trying to figure out what this is. Bottom left, Constitution Ave and North Circle again. And then upper left is Nob Hill area. Additional areas added at that time. So a lot of annexation agreements take place at this time. Some are small, some are quite large. All right, and lastly, while we have a few seconds left, we'll talk very briefly about the period from 1980 to 2020. At this time, basically, our water supplies are coming from the Western Slope reservoirs primarily, and we are pushing for and completing the Southern Delivery System. We are making a lot more agreements with other communities along the Front Range. Our population has boomed essentially from 213,000 to 361,000 people here now that need water. The water, or the records that we have that relate to this, again, are there listed on the right side of your screen. At this time, the decentralization process for city records is basically complete. And so records relating to the cost of construction and legal opinions and that sort of thing are kept in their respective departments now. And so what we would be looking at would just be the records that the city has that relate to this. And again, like Southern Delivery System records and that sort of thing are kept by CSU. So we don't really have access to those anymore. Basically, this period of time is marked by making agreements with other cities, Pueblo, Aurora, that sort of thing, because water rights are bought up for the most part. There's not a lot left to buy up. And as Eric said, that flow is diminishing anyway. And so now we're making agreements with other communities and we're piping water uphill, like he said, from further south to try and supply water for the city. The last screen I have to share with you guys tonight are just some of the stocks that I have in the city clerk's office that relate to water rights we bought in stock. And these are all more recent, as you can see, 2014, 2015, 2009, that sort of thing. And so what we're doing now is we're trying to buy stock in these last remaining companies into the future. Who knows if we'll end up buying them outright like we did with other water supply companies and other competitors like that. And that concludes my presentation. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn everything back over to Meg for questions. I hope that wasn't too fast. I was trying to squeeze it in there.
I am just completely impressed with the number of records the city has. I had no idea when you shared with us you had access to these records. I am just blown away. So thank you.
We have about 600 boxes off-site of additional records that I have not even gotten to yet for inventorying. And so inventorying, I'm making Excel spreadsheets, the date, that sort of thing, information, so that we can access them, and then preserving them, putting in them in proper folders, archival quality, so they don't get damaged. So this is a tiny fraction. There is the amount of research that can be done. If you're a historian and you're interested in that, is just mind-boggling, really.
Well, the sheer number of boxes probably answers this next question. Folks, if you have a question for Casey or for Eric, feel free to pop that in the chat. I had a question for both of you, and Casey, we can start with your response. Since it is the sesquicentennial and it is, 1871 to 2021, how do you think the meaning of water has changed, or has it changed over the past 150 years? And perhaps could you put that in context of your work with records? Is there a record that really sticks out that tells the story of water in the past compared to our experiences today? And then Eric, I'd love to hear it from you as well.
Well, I would definitely say there isn't a particular, just a single record that shows the importance of water. All of them do. And what they all represent is the fact that even from day one in 1871, Palmer understood that water supply here is very minimal. We don't, outside of Fountain Creek, there is not a lot of water. And if you want to build this glistening city on the plains, you need water supply. And so that is a continuing narrative, right? The records show kind of this aggressive acquisition of these rights as long as we could and building these systems into the mountains. And now we're getting to the point where we're kind of still dealing with the fact that there's not a lot of water here. Now we have a huge population, our water supplies are shrinking. And how are we going to move forward? What kind of documents are going to, be produced through the course of business in the next 100 years as we have to acquire more water rights to supply for, for example, banning Lewis Ranch annexation that just took place a few months ago and adds 700 acres to the eastern half of the city. We have to provide water for those people. And so I think that basically the overarching theme here is water scarcity and planning for the future in water acquisition. And I think part of the reason Calder Springs has so much water rights is because the actions that these guys were taking, up until the 1950s and even beyond, and just acquiring everything they could.
That responds to continued growth, rapid growth for sure.
Yeah, and it's only accelerating at this point. And the water supply is getting smaller. So
thank you, Casey.
You're welcome.
Eric, did you have any thoughts to share?
No, it's a lot to take in terms of records. I think the one component I'd say is that, what we don't have here, we do have the components of moving from a communal approach to water in a lot of these community ditches to one that's the urbanization of water, right? Where everything sort of becomes either parceled up into private property rights individually, or becomes urbanized in these larger utility kind of corporations. The things we don't have are because we displaced all indigenous peoples as any kind of ritual or sacred relationship to water. And that to me is the marker, again, like not to be too awkward about it, but it is the Pioneers Museum. And it really reflects sort of that Anglo-American settlement at the time. And so I think that the relationship to water was completely instrumental. Based on resource use, and we've been talking about natural resources. That's our collective language, in this particular society. So we don't really have much of a relationship to water. Most people don't think about it unless they're turning on a tap or unless they're boaters or people who fish and have a passion. So
exactly, and in that line of thought, in everything that I've looked at from city records, including legal opinions and all this, I have not seen one mention of indigenous communities and their need for water, and so. It is absolutely taken from the viewpoint of people who are coming here and are taking the water at this point. So
a question just came through on Facebook. How did the original owners get their rights to own? And there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that question, but thinking about position from indigenous taking this land, taking the water. How do you answer that?
Right.
Well, I mean, our society is based on dispossession, right? So yes, we took native lands and native waters. I think if the person is asking how did people establish private property rights, that's really based on the emerging water code as it develops, right? In the 1870s, 1880s, water cases, like the Coffin case, that are about beneficial use being the basis for allocating private water rights. And it had to be with a clear use in mind. You couldn't just say, yeah, we're claiming 50,000 acre feet. So to its credit, prior appropriation at least avoided a kind of formation of monopoly for large holdings of water rights without any kind of intent to use them, right? You couldn't just speculate and say like, yeah, we want this many water rights. They'd be like, okay, what for? So there's that, but people had to have a really clear intent for what they were going to do it for.
That's definitely a question I had as well, is how with the stuff that Palmer was, giving to the city and the grants that he was making, who made him ownership of that stuff to begin with, right? First come,
individual action,
first serve, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, he came here and he set up his town, and that's what it was.
That's it. And as people diverted and built canals, that's how that became the basis for it. First in time, first in right.
A lot of them, I noticed that ownership maybe came from constructing the canals, and a lot of the deeds and that sort of thing. The people who were selling them talked about, their process of digging them, and how far we dug and how fast and that sort of thing. And so you dig a canal and it's yours, maybe. I don't know. Good question.
Yep. A large part of it was just performance of the property goods. I mean, think of the homesteaders who had to make good, on a land parcel, and that means improvements, a fence, cattle, livestock. Same thing. Is that, we think of property as an object instead of a relationship, and you had to prove the relationship with what you were going to do. in order to get legal recognition to it.
Yeah.
So, interesting.
That could relate to why we have the Homestead Act certificate. Maybe there was a ditch on that property that we wanted. So
Could be. Could be.
Well, Casey, you had mentioned there are a lot of fabulous resources, and it's going to take someone really digging in. Who's going to write the book on Colorado Springs water history? Because that's a lot. What work is to be done locally? Eric, I've heard rumors that you have students that have done some work with local water. Is that true?
I mean, to some extent, I think part of it is that in some ways the dispersal of the records, I think, was always a challenge in the past, right? As Casey was alluding to, that the city has some, CSU has some, right? So there have been some projects on water, but not so fine grained, and we could use some more, local history projects. I'm sure the Department of History has had plenty of senior theses kind of doing this kind of work. I would point to, John Harner's Profiting from the Peak book, which was just published and has a whole chapter on water. So if people want to learn more about the specific water infrastructure and how that developed out, with some of the use of the archival documents that Casey showed, that's a good starting point.
Yeah. Access is one of the biggest issues with not being able to write this, right? Like I said, I've got 600 boxes that I haven't even started inventorying yet. So there's probably a few books in there, and that's across the board for archival work. Anybody who does that understands, right? It takes a lot of money to get through old records.
A lot of people.
Make them usable.